This is for Muscles Lab. It should be quick. So we have axial and appendicular muscles. Basically, axial muscles have both origins and insertions on the axial skeleton, right? So that's the trunk. Whereas appendicular muscles are going to control the movements of your upper and lower limbs, as well as your pectoral and pelvic girdles. These are going to be, this is a big list of muscles. You don't need to know all of them. Look in your lab manual to figure out which ones you need to know. These are most of the superficial and some of the deep that we're going to need to know. This is the anterior view. This is going to be our posterior view. You need to know, once again, most of the superficial and a few of the deep. But we're going to skip over a lot of the deep muscles of the back and the neck. So how do muscles attach to bone? So the main way the muscle is attached to either bone, skin, or another muscle is by a tendon. So a tendon is going to be made of dense, regular connective tissue, and it's going to be a continuation of those connective tissue coverings of the muscle. So we had the endomysium and the perimysium and the epimysium, and those are going to come together as well as to become the tendon. If the tendon is flat, so like a really long, flat, thin sheet that's made more of dense, irregular connective tissue, that's going to be an aponeurosis. And we'll talk about, you'll be identifying the aponeurosis on the top of the head, so the epicranial aponeurosis. Most muscles cross at least one mobile joint, and so that's how they move your skeleton. So when they contract, one bone is going to stay relatively still and the other one's going to move. So attachments for axial muscles, they have a superior and an inferior attachment. Usually the superior attachment is more movable and the inferior attachment is less movable, but it's a little bit less clear in the axial muscles. And we're going to focus a little bit more on the appendicular muscles. So for the appendicular muscles, the proximal attachment is usually less movable, and that's called the origin. And the distal attachment is usually more movable, and that's called the insertion. So a good example of this is going to be our biceps brachii. So the proximal attachments are up here on the scapula, and the distal attachments are down here on the radius. And so when you contract that biceps, which moves, the radius or the scapula? So obviously the radius is moving, right? So that's going to be the more distal attachment. It's distal from the trunk, distal to the trunk, further away. And so we call the proximal attachment the origin, and we call the distal attachment the insertion. So I'm not going to belabor the point, but your fascicles within your muscles can be arranged in different directions. And so we have a couple of different types. So circular, parallel, convergent, and pinnate muscles. I'm really not going to ask too many questions about this, but I do want you to know that the fascicles can go in different directions, and that's what makes some of our muscles able to pull in different directions, and it just kind of changes the function of the muscles. So circular muscles are going to have fibers arranged in concentric circles. They create what's called a sphincter that controls passage of materials into or out of an opening. So orbicularis oris is a good example. Next, we have parallel muscles, and these parallel muscles have all of our fascicles that kind of run parallel to the long axis of the tendon, and so they all pull in the same direction. And the rectus abdominis is a good example. Convergent muscles here are going to have fascicles that sort of converge. So they come together and converge towards a common tendon. And so you can activate different areas of the muscle to kind of pull in different directions. But because all of these fascicles are pulling in slightly different directions, they can't all pull together. And so they might not be quite as, make as much force as a parallel muscle. Last, we have these pinnate muscles. And pinnate muscles, say you have this, they look like a feather or a leaf. So you've got the tendon here, and then you have all these fascicles coming in at an angle. So either a unipinnate, they're all coming in at one angle, or a bipinnate, they're coming in at two different angles. And so they kind of pull at an angle to the tendon. They generate more tension, but they're not pulling the tendon as far as parallel muscles. And a good example of that is the deltoid, which is a multipinnate. And that's one of the reasons it can move in lots of different directions, because you can activate different parts of that muscle. So now we have the actions of skeletal muscles, and they're grouped by primary actions. So the agonist is going to be also known as the prime mover. This is the muscle that actually produces a movement. So first pick a movement, figure out which movement you're talking about. So an example here, we'll talk about extension of the forearm. So we're extending the forearm. So what muscle causes that to happen? Well, you can feel if you extend your forearm that you're using your triceps. So that's going to be the prime mover or the agonist. The antagonist, like, you know, an antagonist in your story, it's like the villain. The antagonist, it's the muscle who opposes the action of the agonist. It does the opposite. And so in this case, it's going to be like your biceps and your brachialis muscles. And so the biceps brachii is an antagonist for forearm extension. Synergist is another word to know, and this is a muscle that assists that prime mover or the agonist. Usually it contributes tension or stabilizes a joint. But the biceps brachii and the brachialis work together as synergists. They work synergistically to flex the elbow joint. Now, lastly, we'll talk a little bit about muscle names. You have an Edpuzzle to do that is called Muscle Names Have Meaning. It kind of goes over this, but it will help hopefully so you guys can remember the names of those muscles. So a couple of things. Your muscles can be named by the muscle action that indicates the muscle's primary function. So for example, the flexor digitorum longus flexes the digits, right? So flexor and digits. Some of them are named for the body region. So the rectus femoris is near the femur, right? Femoris, femur. Some of them are named for their attachments. So like the sternocleidomastoid, which is like this muscle here, it attaches to the sternum and the clavicle and the mastoid process of the skull. Some of them are named based on the orientation of the muscle fibers. So remember we said the rectus abdominis was a straight muscle. Rectus means straight. Some are based on muscle shape. So like the deltoid is shaped like a triangle, and the delta symbol is triangular. And the abductor pollicis longus is a long muscle. Some of them are based on size. So if you have a major and a minor, the major is bigger, the minor is smaller. If you have a maximus, medius, and minimus, the maximus is biggest, medium is middle, medius is middle, and minimus is smallest. And then some of them are named on the number of muscle heads at an attachment site. And so usually you've got a couple different muscle bellies, and they each have a separate tendon or muscle head. And so the triceps brachii has 3 heads, the biceps brachii has 2 heads. If we go back to this slide over here, you can see the 2 different tendons or 2 heads of the biceps up here. These are 2 different attachments there. So that makes sense. Bi is 2, tri is 3. And that is all for this lab, and I will see you guys soon.